Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming and more Elden Ring, because patch 0.14 is here. And with it comes a bunch of rebalancing, big nerfs to the big bad consort Radahn, some PvP specific stuff, and general nerfs that are actually affecting PvE. After testing through things, we found that there's some noticeable changes to the top or best options that you have for DLC specific weapons. I'm pretty happy with the changes overall, and I'd like to see more updates like this coming in the future, maybe without as big a gap. Anyway, what I'm doing is taking a look at the best DLC weapons and ranking them compared to one another on a tier list, as you can see. However, plenty of weapons on this list remain generally similar in their ranking. So I'm going to be covering all the weapons that have changed initially, going into more depth and detail onto them and what's changed and why that's relevant. And then we'll blast through the ones that, are basically where they were before and the same reasons. Just know that if it appears on this list, it's one of the best DLC specific weapons. It is a PvE list. With that said, let's begin with the new weapon that makes it to the list down in C tier. It's the newly buffed Obsidian Levi. Here's what happened to this one. It was specifically the weapon art that was buffed. They reduced the stamina consumption on the combo. They increased the poise damage on the follow-up heavy attacks. They increased the movement distance of the first follow-up heavy attack specifically. Reduced stamina consumption's really nice because this combo was overly expensive on that, and it meant you could only really do one combo, maybe 1.5, before having to really recover your stamina. The first part of the actual combo is really cool though, having you backstep and have those kind of iframes. Using that to evade an attack and then going with the combo is the best way to do it, because while the enemy or the target is actually recovering from their attack, you're already going in with this lengthy combo. The worst, most offensive part of it though was definitely when you would do that dodge evade, go for the follow-up dash back in heavy, and then that would miss due to the range of that dash back in being too small. However, despite the improvement to that, follow-up heavy attack and the bigger dash that it has, I still can miss targets with this, which is incredibly frustrating, and a big part of why it's still C tier, though it has made it to the list now. The other big change is the increased poise damage of follow-up heavy attacks. This seems to be the follow-up heavy attacks of the combo, so the multiple part combo that it is, you continuously press heavy attacks. That now has better poise damage, and you can feel it when you get a bunch of these off on a target and watch it stagger. So I just don't think overall this is remotely competitive with Bloody Hellas, even after this buff. Out of the two kind of dynastic weapons we have, this is the worst one still. But it deserves an acknowledgement because it's feeling a lot better now. Now we move up to B tier, where a lot of these weapons are finding themselves. As before, the Sword of Light and Darkness remain B tier despite their buff this patch. What they did specifically was take the Ash of War or weapon art of the Sword of Light and Darkness and literally increase its quote attack speed. This essentially means that it's triggering the unique weapon skills of these weapons faster, which to be honest is exactly what they need for the weapon art specifically. However, they didn't touch the straight swords themselves in a scaling way, which is a massive problem for these weapons. They're really poor scaling, so it's often hard to make them work, although you can of course, just as direct weapons for your source of holy damage. Light will give you a body buff, increasing your holy damage. Darkness will debuff the enemy, increasing the holy damage you deal to them. And the meta for these weapons is to give up Darkness entirely and just use Light in any holy build, because it's super good to have a body buff that increases your holy damage in a build where you're using holy. After this patch, we're still going to be doing that, but now it's just smoother and faster, and technically the Darkness Sword is significantly more relevant to actually apply because it comes out quicker. So definitely better, but not worthy of pushing it up a tier in any way. There's still just a stick to apply an ash and swap off. What has changed significantly though is the Relina's Twin Blades. It's now in a B tier and even on this list in the first place because of these kind of three big things. Firstly, they've messed with the actual scaling, and that was one of the biggest kind of problems I had with the weapon. If you were level 200 or 250, essentially relatively over leveled, these would scale fine. Even though they're scaling at C, your high enough numbers would result in good DPS. But at say level 150, you don't have high enough numbers to have relevant scaling when it's all scaling at C grade. It's still all scaling at C grade, but they've tweaked the actual attribute scaling of the weapon for lower intelligence of faith attributes, and so we're feeling that in kind of a slight DPS increase on everything. This is significant because it's going to apply to everything you do with the weapon really, but beyond that they've also buffed the weapon art in multiple ways. They've taken the magic light wave and increased its range, the poise damage, which is crazy, and the attack speed, allowing you to do the 3-part combo, the first 2 waves, the second 2 waves, and the final slam. You get that all much quicker, but you can get the first 2 off and then actually roll out of it when you're about to be punished, or maybe later during the combo, much more consistently, allowing you to actually get this off and then not pay for it, which means it's usable. Amazing. The range itself is just a nice feature for poke, and then the fact that they gave it increased poise damage was so surprising to me. I'm actually staggering bosses with this now. It feels really good. Further, they buffed the fire part, the heavy. They've increased the poise damage from the stance's heavy attack, which I also didn't expect because that was already pretty decent on the poise damage. Now it's even better. Now it's even more reliable as an attack for close combat. Between these two specific weapon art buffs, I feel you can mix and match them a lot more than just relying on the heavy one as before. The base weapon is dealing more damage as well, but it gets even better when we consider the Rea Cameo talisman buff, because what that does is increase the damage you get on your following attack when holding a stance. Now what they've done is reduce the delay the damage enhancement actually activates, so it's down from like a second and a half to a second, and they've also increased the damage buff you get from it. So that is very relevant for this one. Where are you using your Ash stance style combat, and it comes out super smooth in a way where you kind of hold it for a moment and then it's there. A lot of the time it triggers without you even thinking about it. So that's going to be good for any weapon that has stance style Ashes of War, of which you know there's a lot, and combined with the weapon art buffs and the scaling improvements, it's feeling really good. Some people might even argue for like a low A tier on this, but right now I think B is a fair place. Like, it just made it onto the list, and it's not C tier, it's B tier. I think that's pretty good. Next up, we should talk about Devonia's Hammer, which is now on the list and at B tier. This is an interesting one. What they did is they buffed specifically the weapon art. So Devonia's Vortex, they've increased the attack power of it, they've extended the attack range of the Great Hammer's spin, they've increased the poise value and poise generation speed, and again they've done that damage animation recovery time when attacks hit another player thing. What we care about then is the damage increase it's got and the range of it, as well as the poise value and poise generation speed. What this means is it's hitting way harder and in bigger range. You got more protection during it so that, you know, you're less likely to be interrupted during it. So it's now become much more competitive with the very similar weapon, the Ordovis Greatsword, and that weapon art. However, Ordovis's Greatsword hits for less but comes out faster, and we really feel that with this. Even now with these buffs, the actual charged full charge hit is slow as hell. In many cases against many of these DLC bosses, you're not going to get that full charge off. It's either going to move away or interrupt you, even with your poise protection that we now have. Obviously, it really helps and makes it more viable. Sometimes you can get it out in trade or try to time it after they're doing the recovery animation, but it does mean a lot of these times I'm having to tap slam it, which is less damage. And ultimately, when you're tap slamming this, the Ordovis Greatsword is significantly better because it comes out quicker and at full charge will deal more. I think it's hard to argue even now that Ordovis's Greatsword isn't better. I think it definitely is because it's much more reliable output, but at least now they're competitive in some way. And you know, this weapon as a base hammer with a colossal moveset and damage behind it, I think is better than Ordovis's Greatsword. You pretty much just use Ordovis's Greatsword for the Ash. So I keep it at a B overall, even though the output is A worthy if you get to get those charge slams off. Against humanoids with low poise, you will, and it's devastating, but against most of the DLC big bads, it kind of holds it back for me. We'll see, but either way, I really like it now. Next then, let's talk about hand-to-hand weapons. And obviously for this, I've got Dane's Footwork, which is my preferred one because there's those boots in the game that actually increase your damage with those types of attacks, and I like the moveset a lot. Heavy attacks were one of the best parts of this weapon, and what they've done is improved that. They've increased the damage flat out, shortened the recovery time between some normal attacks and follow-up attacks, but most importantly, increased the attack speed of the uncharged version of the first heavy attack for these weapons. So your tap heavies are coming out really quickly. So for this, yeah, I used Dane's Footwork, using the Dryleaf Whirlwind Ash with a kind of bleed setup. The weapons are always good for charge heavies and Ash spam, leading to good bursts of damage and soon enough stagger. Now it's easier to get those quick punishes out and maybe even combo into a full charge heavy in those windows of opportunity. The damage remains pretty alright, and the stagger buildup is still decent. It's just not comparable to something like, you know, the busted fist weapons and their heavy spam, but I think this is a clever change overall, giving the weapon type a bit more damage, but giving it more versatility in the moveset. It kind of makes the light attacks feel way less worth using because the tap heavies are so good and they lead into charge heavies super well, alongside whatever Ash you choose to run. So I like it. I think it stands out. I can't say it feels busted strong, but definitely solid, now making it onto the list. and in B tier for me. Next then is the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, which is a colossal sword. Kind of randomly, they made the colossal sword weapon type have better move distance when attacking, so it kind of lunges a bit further on some of the attacks, which feels a bit random but is nice, as well as the speed of the first normal attack, so it just comes out a bit quicker. Basically, what you've got here is a colossal sword that has a unique weapon art that lunges forward, thrusting at great range and exploding on the follow-up. That is why this weapon is very relevant, because it's a fine enough colossal sword, but there's better ones. But then the weapon art gets you to the target, opening up surprise punish windows on a normally slow weapon, and leads into potential for stagger and generally good damage. Now the base weapon moveset as a whole for this weapon type is better. It is feeling slightly better, but certainly not enough to push it to A tier or something. It's just a fine weapon. So yeah, keeping it down in B. Next up after that then, we have Messmer's Soldier Spear, which I still keep in B, but I think it's still arguable for A. It's personal preference. At the end of the day, you've got a big heavy spear that has a really unique charged heavy, allowing for some serious poke potential behind it. That is really good for poise break. The damage behind it's good, the range is good, but ultimately it's very one note. You're basically just using it for those thrusts or the charged attack thrusts, and that's it. It is very good, but I just don't find it very fun. So I keep it down in B tier because the power and relevance of that is certainly there, but it doesn't really compete with other charge heavy spammers that are just gonna get to the point better. Up in A tier then, we have the Rakshasa's Great Katana, which was buffed back in patch 0.13, I believe. They increased the speed of the attacks, leading to a massive buff for just spamming the unique weapon art, which is what this weapon is all about. You have to trade, building up great damage, successive hits, and bleed, and because that's faster, you're now able to do that significantly quicker, to the point where it's relevant even against bosses in this DLC. That'll never work in higher levels of New Game Plus where you're getting smashed for trading, but you know, in lower levels or base, this is absolutely phenomenal for its DPS output. But we don't push it any higher because to trade is a bad thing. Also in A tier then, we have the Red Bear's Claw. They changed this in the last patch. The 3-hit combo hits hard with the potential to stagger alongside the base bleed buildup that the weapon has. What they specifically did for it was increase the attack power of it and increase the poise value when using the weapon skill. So spamming the weapon skill is actually really potent with these weapons. And then there's a kind of claw fist weapons. They have charged heavy attacks that are really potent too. We very much like the potential of this weapon at the current stage of the game. Also in A tier, though we could argue for high A or maybe even S tier on this one, you'll have to, decide for yourself. It's Milady using specifically wing stance, because just like we said for the other light great swords on this list, the Rea Cameo talisman has been buffed to give you that buff quicker and increase the damage it gives you too. You are using this weapon for a variety of reasons. It's very cool moveset, sure, but with wing stance specifically, it's so effective. The light combo into a heavy combos super well, getting off successive hits, and then a huge punish. But even with the wing stance, just using that leap heavy is so potent for the damage and the poise break that it has, and all they've done with that talisman change is make this even faster and more potent. So I think it's very good, high A easily, if not maybe arguable for S tier with this change. Unchanged though is the Death Knight's longhaft axe, which I still really like for its awesome unique weapon skill that has you kind of blink bolt forward, iframe through attacks, deal damage with lightning, leap up slam down with physical and more lightning damage. This allows you to use the base moveset, which is quick and effective and solid on the stagger, and then instead of evading, evade by using the weapon skill, which feels incredible on a slower heavy hitter weapon like this. Lightning damage in general is amazing in this DLC with the armors that enhance this kind of thing. The damage type is so buffable. And then, too, you can use the weapon skill as a kind of gap closer or escape. It's very versatile and a really cool weapon. Very similar to the Fire Knight's Greatsword, which I still rate in A tier. This is technically changed as well, just like the Ancient Meteoric Ore Blade. As a colossal sword, it has increased move distance when attacking and increased the speed of the first normal attack, so it comes out a bit quicker. This was already a kind of more vertical moveset for a colossal sword, and it felt quicker. Not massive change, again, not enough to push it higher, but something that was already good, feeling a bit smoother and easier to use, is always a welcome change. Especially with the Flame Spear, Ash of War in particular, the gap closer, the poise break that has. It's just such a good option. Super comparable to the thrust style of the Ancient Meteoric Greatsword, but literally better. So again, love this one. Minor buff this patch. Finally then, for this tier, we have the Sword of Night Katana. Technically changed this patch as a weapon type that was affected by the increased attack speed of the uncharged version of the first heavy attack. That is quite relevant for this one when you think about it. When you use the weapon skill of this unique weapon, you can tap it or charge it. The tap sends out multiple strikes, where the charged version will do heavier hitting ones with a kind of explosion of shadow after. The charged heavies though on this are really nice, comboing well into the weapon art. With that coming out uncharged quicker, and you're trying to build successive hits with this weapon type in particular, it is a subtle but interesting change and improvement for this weapon. It just makes it feel a bit smoother and easier to actually land. Certainly not a massive change, but a subtle one that just again makes the weapon feel better. So I'm happy with that change. Overall, the potential of this weapon, the output is good. It's still just a bit awkward to get that weapon skill out, but it does give you that lunge in, and that's how you kind of make it work. All right, next then in the S tier, we still have the Claws of Night, because, these are still insane. In patch 1.13, they fixed a bug where the physical attack attribute of the scatter shot throw skill was different than expected. And based on testing after that patch, it seems the longer range damage of the weapon skill is reduced, and it was already relatively low. The reason you would use that is free punish, just to get it out, and also building up a bit of bleed. But ultimately, the way you would use this weapon is by pressing yourself against the target to kind of shotgun blast them with all of the thrown attacks. That damage is, very potent still, and so we still rate it very high. And outside of that, you've got these long claws that have really nice range for claw style weapons, and super quick light attack combos for successive and bleed build up, and that's still there, alongside the utility of the scatter shot throw. So they're still really good, just like the backhand blades. And this is a funny one. In patch 1.13, Swift Slash with reduced movement distance and longer recovery time, but personally I prefer the blind spot Ash of War for this use in PvE anyway, giving me a nice evade while still attacking, thrusting, counter-attacking potentially for the massive damage that has. And you could spam that. Technically, this weapon type has been nerfed in this patch though, but not in a relevant way. It's weird. The backhand blade weapon type had decreased attack speed of normal attacks from a crouching position. So a crouch attack, the speed that comes out is slower. I would imagine that was being used in PvP, because I wasn't really using it in PvE. I was using the running attacks, the base light attacks, maybe heavies, and especially the Ash of War blind spot most of all. So I leave it as S tier, still incredible as a weapon and Ash of War combo. Lastly for S tier then, we still have the falx in S tier due to the Revenger's Blade weapon skill. That was actually buffed in patch 1.13 with increased directional control for the follow-up attacks after a strong attack, basically allowing you to maintain that many hit combo more accurately on a target. The damage is still great, the successive build-up, the bleed potential. This is why this weapon's so good. And also, not to forget, curved swords in power stance with the running attacks, the jump attack spam, still super good. So if you can get the actual weapon art combo off on this one, my god, the damage is fantastic. And yep, that's not changed. Lastly, in S plus then, we're going to be quick on this. Euphoria is still one of the best weapons in the entire game. After the buff in patch 0.13, where they decreased the number of attacks required to restore the weapon's luster to get the buff going, they increased the duration of that buff effect, and then they've also increased the holy damage when the weapon has its luster restored. So it's absolutely insane, and certainly still is. In fact, you could argue it's technically better this patch, because you'd probably want to combine this, of course, for the holy damage buff with the Sword of Light, and how that buff comes out slightly quicker now, though you're still doing it before the combat, so hardly matters. But if I was going to say anything about this patch being relevant to this, I guess it would be that. Super cool weapon, and it's good to see it maintain its high tier status in this patch. Lastly, still absolutely insane, of course, is the bloodfiends arm, which you basically just slam with heavy attacks to build up insane bleed, poise break, and raw damage, leading to, 3 or 4 hitting even bosses in the DLC. Still one of the easiest and most potent weapons in the game, outside of DLC as well. And yeah, it's still absolutely insane, so yeah, S+. That finally brings us to the end of this tier list. I hope you can understand my reasoning, but yeah, it is really nice to see so many weapons actually make it onto the list or be changed in slight ways, even if they're not necessarily gone up or down a tier. And when we're in that later stage of the DLC, when people are more looking to do challenges and use things that are harder to run, this is just great. But I hope this was useful to you if you've not jumped in yet yourself. For now then, I've been Hollow, you've been you. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.